week's cover story is a very fascinating story, frankly, and it's really dives deep into a part of history that has been largely forgotten by pretty much everybody in New Orleans, really, except for Quinn Bishop here, who wrote the story for us this week, and she is a tour guide, a historian, a writer, activist, a content creator, sort of a Jackie of all trades or hats, I guess. And it's a really fascinating story. Basically, Quinn took a deep dive into the history of New Orleans and rock and roll, specifically looking at the influence that black drag queens had on the creation of rock and roll and really on what became a world-changing cultural phenomena. And it's really, really fascinating. So, Quinn, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Just tell people a little bit about what the story's about and kind of, how you got interested in this stuff to begin with, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I grew up listening to oldies. I had a babysitter. It was all she would listen to. So I grew up listening to...
I don't know how old you are, but like oldies is like, you're talking like 1950s, right?
We're talking 50s. So we're talking like Little Richard. We're talking, I think, the Witch Doctor song, whatever that one was. This is what I grew up listening to. And so I always knew Little Richard's music, those kind of things. And just researching like queer history, like gay history in the city, I just started to learn about, so there was someone who brought up to me that Little Richard used to perform at the Dewdrop Inn and drag. And so I just started diving into it, and I realized there was this entire community, 50s through the 70s, of these drag clubs in the city that catered towards straight people. They were segregated. There were multiple different scenes, and there was just this massive, thriving community of drag performing right alongside people like Otis Redding, Ike and Tina Turner, Ray Charles performed over there. And it was just something that I'd heard about. I got to meet someone who had written an article way back in the day, had interviews with people. So it's been this research that I've had kind of sitting in my repertoire of queer history things for years. And I've started talking more about it this year, and I was just so grateful to be able to share it with more people through this article.
One of the things in your story that I thought was really interesting is the fact that a lot of the drag clubs were catering towards a straight, ostensibly at least straight clientele, and that this was not just sort of an insular thing, which a lot of the clubs and bars and coffee shops in New Orleans that were open to queer people being sort of accepted in them, oftentimes it was kind of specifically for them or for a community that was okay with that. Whereas this was a different kind of a thing.
Yeah, it depends on the side of the community. So the Club My Oh My was designed for straight guys, essentially, to come through, for anyone in the community to come in there. And then within the black community, it was a little bit more integrated. It's two parts of the community. This was something that I think was pretty unique to New Orleans. There were in other cities, there were clubs that would have drag that were different. But in New Orleans, there was something about a couple of the clubs that I talk about in the article that was just everybody liked the queens. They wanted to come and see them. It was just, there was a lot of talent and a crossover in the community that I think you saw a lot of queer people going to those same spaces, but the more straight community were kind of sharing those spaces and just loving what was essentially a really exciting moment in art, I think, and an exciting moment in music.
Also, I found it interesting that tourists also, it was a big tourist thing too.
Huge tourist thing.
Which is crazy. Because I think people today feel like the culture sometimes of New Orleans has been there's a part of it that is sort of sold to tourists that is very old, right? But in fact, back in the day when this was new, when everything that people consider to be old culture of New Orleans was still brand new, it was being sold to tourists, and people were coming for it,
Yeah, I mean, we have some things. There was for printing it in Europe, they were advertising for some of these clubs. They were come to New Orleans, this kind of stuff. I know is Patsy Vidalia, who was talked about in the article. So many people, these major celebrities, would want to come here and see her host the show just because of how funny she was and how the way that she could work the crowd. So it just created this kind of culture around it. It's not the only space where you would see these kind of culture pop up. New Orleans was instrumental in the rise of rock and roll. It was by no means the only place where it was coming up. But New Orleans had just this magic about it that so many people kind of were able to launch themselves off from here. I think it has to do with just the long history of music in the city that really made it possible for it to yet again change the history of the world through music. I just think about the influence on that rock had for so many different people, the way it changed the way that people listen to music, the way people go to concerts. And I just think about New Orleans being once again at kind of the forefront of culture.
Yeah.
It's like, it feels like it always is. But
Well, and one of the things in your story that I thought like is interesting, and I guess it's to a certain degree, if you know anything about the history of rock, in hindsight, it seems almost obvious, because a lot of this got channeled through the person of Little Richard, and that he picked up a lot of his sort of persona in a lot of ways was not, he didn't steal it, but he was so heavily influenced by the queens in New Orleans that. And could you talk a little bit about that, about like sort of how he evolved over those couple of years in the early 50s,
Yeah, so I think that he was influenced. He was kind of a part of a community that was influencing each other. Like he was kicked out of his home at 13 and was going around with like what were called, there were minstrel shows at the time, but many of them were all like Black community kind of spaces, and there was just female impersonation is what they called it then, that they were just doing. So he was there meeting these other people also doing this, and they were kind of innovating this music style together, touring around the country. It was really, New Orleans was a place where it became a consistent space for what had been a touring culture, that people were kind of like, I mean, it was almost like the circus almost. It was kind of really just, it was presented in this way that I think would make many people uncomfortable today, especially considering some of the other things that were happening alongside it. But then he kind of just, I think he's someone that kind of had the breakout, kind of because, like, I think it's weird to call, like, Little Richard, like, a more, like, reserved performer. I think it's crazy to say today. But at the time, that's really what was happening. His record label came in, like, saw him perform that. He was trying to be, like, a crooner, essentially. And then they just saw him perform that song, and they were like, we have to adapt this. Dorothy LaVorstra, like, really worked to kind of make it what it is today. But it was kind of this like attempt to take this culture that was kind of like very like filthy lyrics. It was all kind of, it was very sexual. And they decided to put an edited version of it out there alongside a lot of other artists who were kind of putting out some similar things at the time. But Little Richard, I think has just an incredible performer and had this kind of, this like drive within him that kind of brought it into the mainstream. It was such a crossover hit too.
Yeah.
That I think it made it to where no one could see, but was kind of like right in front of everyone's face, even though he was like kind of talking about it at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, he did have his kind of Christian arc for a while, but it was, I mean, he talks about it. He was just like, yeah, I was gay. I was gay. And then I reformed myself, but he admits to it throughout his life. But then people still forget it. Like I've talked to someone recently. They're like, Little Richard just pretended to be gay. And I was like, it's just not true.
Well, that's such a preposterous thing to say. Like no one in the 1950s was going to just pretend for shits and giggles.
It doesn't
right?
make any sense.
Yeah.
And we have like a lot of the other performers, it was like a constant fear that they would be caught for these kind of things.
Right.
But of course, they're still going out there and doing it, which I think is like, even among the worst political climate for gay artists, they were still like getting caught. A lot of times just things in restrooms, those kind of things. A guy named Johnny Ray later. But there's so many people who were just out and open anyway.
Well, that's the thing that I think is so interesting about it, is that like the drag queens, the Black drag queens in particular in New Orleans, were very, ostentatious is a kind of a one word that you might be able to use, because they were just so like, and you could see it like in Little Richard's style, like in his clothing and his swagger, all those kind of things. And at the time that they were doing it, they were literally, people throwing Molotov cocktails into like the windows of bars that let gay people come in, and or like the Quorum Club on Esplanade. They had like people threw bricks through the windows because they let trans people be trans people in there, and they decided they hated that. And it's such a I don't want to say an act of defiance, because I don't think that's necessarily really what they were doing. It was just like an act of being yourself that, like, in the 1950s seems improbable,
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, like, I think that saying, like, an act of defiance, I think that they were in a space where they were basically pushed to the total edges of society. Like, Little Richard, like, and so many of these people were literally, they were just going from place to place, doing whatever they could to make money. And I think that's really how it kind of started. And everything else that kind of spiraled out of it was kind of on accident, right? Mm-hmm. They were just, I'm going to perform, because what else am I going to do that's going to let me do these kind of things? It was on stage, there was a space for this kind of thing to happen. I think yes, there was like a real attack on people who were gay. There was just horrible things happening in the 50s in New Orleans. There's just, the stories are awful. But I think that on stage, people were still going to see it. I think there's to be said about that even today, where people will go to like a drag brunch and then vote against some of the same things. Like, yeah. So I've met those people before, but there's a certain level of if it's performed, if it's fun, if it's silly. I think people can like rationalize that to themselves and say like, oh, this is just a performance, it's for fun. And someone like Patsy Vidalia, who I talk about specifically, I mean, you'll get like conflicting reports. Like some people say he, and then someone else will say she was always dressed up like a woman, like she would never get out of the drag. That's just how she lived. And then it's just one of these kind of things. And it is also, yeah.
Well, no, like, that actually is like kind of segues into like the next thing I want to talk to you a little bit about, because a lot of your work outside of writing the story, obviously, is history based and sort of preserving and telling the history of queer people in New Orleans. You know, you run queer tours and you're obviously doing research and stuff. You know, and if you could talk a little bit about the importance of doing that, particularly for queer people in this country, because
I'm so sorry about that. That is my fault. All right.
Sorry. If you could talk a little bit about that, like, and about the you know, how often, because it feels like so often the history of queer people in this country, and really every country, gets erased really fast, you know, for a variety of reasons. And so, yeah, if you could talk a little bit about the broader work that you've been doing, yeah.
Right, so I think that, I mean, there's so many people who've been doing the research kind of before I came in. When I started doing tours, is where I kind of came into it. I was working as a drag performer and was kind of looking for a day job. But then I kind of recognized that I have this skill of like kind of bringing stories to life. That's like storytelling has always been something that I've done. And I think just being able to talk to people about telling these stories in a way that connects with them. I meet so many people like who are queer who have no connection to history, who essentially like they're taught this kind of thing that seems boring to them, which I almost feel like is very intentional. I think we're told this is what's important, this is what's here, and I think telling queer history is a way to kind of get people interested in history more broadly, just because I think it gets erased so quickly because it's not seen as important. I think we, especially things like bar culture, things like, oh, this performer was here, those kind of things, it's really easy to kind of take it out of its context, especially with something like rock. I mean, I think there's so many I think that like rock and roll became everything from like metal to all of these kind of music styles, and I think you can see queer people throughout all of those art forms, but it's really easy to kind of push that side away because it makes people uncomfortable. And I think it's like the aesthetics of like queer people build for ourselves are really easy for people to take away. So I don't necessarily know like why it happens so fast, but I think it's intentional. I mean, we have people who are embarrassed of their family members. I mean, I pretty regularly experience like through research, like, oh, then all of their letters were burned, their like diaries were burned by their family. They didn't want people to know what they were doing. I mean, someone like Little Richard having this like Christian awakening, those kind of things, which I don't think are in conflict. Plenty of people don't find them to be, but a lot of people did, and they have this sense of shame, so they erase their own history. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. I look at my old posts and I'm like, I hate how I look there, and I delete it. But I think that especially today, it's really important. I think we believed that the internet is like, this is going to be recorded forever. But I think now, because there's so much information, it disappears quicker than it ever has.
Yeah.
And like, I try to educate people and just connect people to the history. I think a lot of the younger queer people, especially after 2020, are so disconnected from the rest of the community that it's kind of like bridging those gaps and kind of trying to rebuild something that was lost through these these consistent like losses that our community's gone through.
If you want to see the whole interview with Quinn, which we talk about a lot of more stuff in it, it goes on for maybe like 10, 12 minutes or so. Definitely check out bestofneworleans.com, our YouTube channel, and all the other kind of great internet.com spaces that you might find the series of tubes on.